Okay, hello everyone. My goal today is to go through the leanest slide deck presentation you've ever seen. So Dave Walsh reached out to me about this CLF meeting and this talk, mainly to shed some light into, since we're talking about construction and carbon and cost, shed some light and dive a little deeper into this study that we, Skanska, participated in with the Rocky Mountains Institute. And so I'm just going to go through that real quick. The first big thing I want to point out with this is the date of the publication. And we'll get into this in my next slide. But so this was published back in August of 2021. So you can kind of infer that the data within the study was based on Q1, Q2 2021 data within the EC3 tool for embodied carbon. I think for those who have been following closely along with embodied carbon and EC3 and EPDs and all of the data that's been circulating over the last few years, we have come a long way even since August of 2021 and the year 2021. So I want to bring that up only because this is truly a snapshot in time back then of where we are at. If we were to run this similar study today, I'm sure the results would be a little bit different. So that's a big caveat. So anyways, going into this Rocky Mountain Institute study that we did a couple of years ago, just to go through, so saving you the half an hour to hour, depending on how fast of a reader you are, to actually go through the study, I'm just going to lay it all out there with the scope of the study, the baselines, the data, all that good stuff. So first off, scope of emissions that were included in the study, A1 to A3, that's it. It was just EC3 in 2021. So obviously there's no A4 and A5 component back then. So that is strictly the scope of this study, no other life cycle stages. The study was also focused on procurement. So Blake just went through a great example of looking at early design decisions that can actually reduce material quantity and optimize your embodied carbon from an early design and pre-construction perspective, which I also want to add is crucial, like equally as important as material procurement, because the most sustainable steel or concrete product we can get is the one that's never actually manufactured in the first place. So I think, design optimization early on and actually reducing material quantity is crucially important. It was not part of this RMI study. This was purely focused on procurement of materials. So I just want to make sure that's out there. The study was based on 3 past Skanska projects. So not a huge sample size. But 3 projects within our portfolio that were constructed a few years ago. And then perhaps the most important part of this study that I want to highlight is that our baseline from which we were accounting for reductions was actually the conservative 80th percentile of EPD emissions for that particular material search back in 2021. And that is crucially important because as more EPDs have been introduced and published, that baseline would be different today, and it's different from the CLF baselines. I think it's really important when we're talking about reductions in embodied carbon, we need to be very transparent about the baseline that we're using because those baselines can dramatically change the numbers. But for those wondering, the study says, I think it's, we can achieve an embodied carbon reduction of anywhere between 19 to 46% on a given project without much of a cost premium. That reduction is based on the 80th percentile conservative EPD emission search for that snapshot in time. So very important to know with that study. And then of course, the materials that were studied, you can see that's mainly structure and envelope. So there's not much with interior finishes and no MEP included. So just getting that all out there. So with this study, I think one of the big things that we got out of it, or at least that the Rocky Mountain Institute was touting in the study itself, is that for key materials, for the most part, you can reduce embodied carbon by a certain ceiling or percentage without either any cost impact or a marginal cost impact. But of course, marginal cost impact, that's a subjective term. But really how this all worked is that we utilized the EC3 data at the time. So this is similar to one of Katie's slides previously, but here we have an example for rebar. So for our study, for one of our projects, we ran the search for, you can see kind of at the bottom left there, we just ran the search for Washington, Oregon, and California based rebar mills, because for this project, that's typically where we've seen our subcontractors and fabricators source rebar from. And then we said, okay, so what's the lowest on the spectrum amongst all those mills within EC3? And it was Nucor Seattle, which, isn't shocking, given our electric grid here in Seattle. And so we just pulled comparable cost data from past projects where we had asked this question, like, hey, if, like, we went to our rebar fabricator and said, for this particular project, if we were to ask for specifically Nucor rebar, is there a cost impact? If so, what is it? And so we've had, and this goes into the nuance of construction cost. Depending on who your bidder is, who your fabricator is, you might come back with an answer that says there's no cost impact. You might come back with an answer that says there's a 5% premium. So we're taking kind of the worst case of what we've seen and said, this is what we've seen in the past for that specific ask. And we did that for all these different materials, all those materials that you were looking at previously. And so these were the main results that we got out of the study. And so you can kind of read through between concrete, rebar, insulation, glazing specifically, what came out of that. I do want to say, so, with RMI's kind of publication language, when they're saying low cost premium, I mean, that's plus or minus 5%-ish in that ballpark. So these were the results that came out of that. And I just gave the example of like the Nucor rebar. Like for glazing at the time, vitro flat glass was our lowest embodied carbon option in EC3 back then. So we said, okay, based on past projects where we've gone through this process and asked for this, what was the premium per pound of glass compared to like Guardian or Cardinal, some of the others that were in our material search. And that's all these numbers are produced. So I think the big thing is, I think RMI's big headline grab was that you can reduce embodied carbon with either no or low cost premium. And I think what they cited was, in the grand scheme of things with the total project budget, you can reduce embodied carbon by 19 to 46% while only maybe adding 1% to the project budget as a whole. Which sounds great for a publication, but I would bet that most folks on this call who have worked on any project, even adding a fraction of a percent to the budget, like when you're putting your GMP estimate together, is usually an uphill battle with a client. Maybe I've just been really unlucky and have never gotten the chance to work with a client who's been like, oh yeah, 1% added to the budget for embodied carbon, no problem, high five, let's do it. It's never that easy. And so I know, RMI is saying that, but I think in reality of our industry, if you have $100 million project, adding 1% to the budget is not an insignificant amount of money. So I think that's one thing to highlight and kind of contextualize with that RMI study. The other thing, and this is like a painfully out of date reference, but I was thinking of this as a chess game, and there was a show that featured chess, so I just threw it in here. The other thing to consider is that RMI study only talks about carbon and cost. But in reality, and I think everyone in this call knows this, but there's more to the equation and more to the chess game than just carbon and cost. There's also the performance of the product. There are the schedule impacts of the product, whether it's install time on site, supply chain, lead times, all of that kind of stuff. There's the constructability of the product, especially when we talk about concrete mixes. Those reductions that I was showing earlier, the 14 to 33% at none to low cost premium, that's great because we know we can get concrete mixes that are low carbon and aren't going to blow the budget up. But will those mixes pour and finish on site and achieve the level of quality that we need and finish? That's a huge consideration with concrete. There's warranty issues, especially, Blake was talking about foam and rigid insulation. When you have a rigid insulation product that is part of your roofing assembly, you better make sure your warranty is in check when you're talking about swapping out for a new lower embodied carbon product. There's the healthy material side of it. We've seen products where one product is lower on embodied carbon, but has like a red list chemical, and one is higher on embodied carbon, but is free of redless chemicals. So there's trade-offs there. There's the unknown, such as COVID or such as the myriad of things that I've seen where teams will come to us and say, we can't get this product for X, Y, and Z reasons because of some complexity in the supply chain market. There's aesthetics. Katie knows this. Aesthetics and architectural intent is very important. You can't always just, sweep that by the wayside. So there's all these other things other than cost that come into the picture when it comes to selecting low carbon products. I just want to make sure to highlight that. Like, cost is just one part of the equation. Okay, so getting into, so that was the RMI part of the presentation. I did talk with Dave. We're also going to just run through, it'll be a demonstration on how you can use the EC3 tool to level bids. So for the builders on the call, when you're putting bid packages out on the street and getting bids back, how can we present embodied carbon information so that it's useful to the owner or the client? And so it's a lot like going to the supermarket, just like how we're going to the construction market. We're just obtaining information and trying to make an informed decision. So similar to how you would go to the supermarket and maybe be looking at your nutrition labels for calories or carbohydrates or sugars, whatever it might be, we're just treating it the same way with carbon. We're looking at the information we have and trying to make a best decision. And so what that looks like, so for all of our Skanska developed work, we've started, at a minimum, we've started putting out this bid language for all of our bid packages for concrete supply, rebar, structural steel, and asphalt. And I think I've talked about this on past CLF calls, so I won't go too into detail, but really it's telling our subcontractors and our bidders that, hey, the embodied carbon that you report in your bid proposal will be used as part of the overall bid analysis. So when you're submitting your bid amount against your competitors, carbon will be part of that analysis. We're not going to say that it's going to be the make or break factor. It's just another data point that we're using when we're considering award and presenting that information to the client. And so we have just some standard forms that we have, like in this case, our concrete suppliers fill out. I mean, honestly, at this point, we've gotten to a point where we have almost every single EPD for every single mix design from all the major concrete suppliers in Seattle. So we sometimes don't even need this form. We can just look at the bid proposal and say, okay, we have all the mix designs. We can run the analysis in EC3. And so for those who don't know or who haven't played around with it, EC3 has a bid leveling function in it now, where you can actually, so all that information I showed in that form, once it's been filled out by the bidder, you can get that into EC3, and EC3 will spit out some nice graphics and allow you to look at the carbon data side by side. So in this case, this is from a project last year. So we have bidder A, bidder B, bidder C. Ooh, one thing I forgot. One thing that is what we like to open up the discussion for with this bid form is that on the far right, you can see there's a section for voluntary alternates where, like our concrete suppliers, if they choose to voluntarily, they can propose lower carbon mixes. So they have their base bid mix design, and then what they would recommend as a lower carbon mix that they could consider, or that the project could consider. So going back into this EC3 bid leveling function, we can get all that information into the tool. Once we have our final leveled bid amounts for our bid package, we can also add that into EC3, and then we can look at it all side by side. So again, going into carbon and costs, this is one of the ways we can look at that on a procurement level as a general contractor. So you can see the red bar is cost, the blue bar is carbon. Bidder A is way out there with their costs, so they've kind of been DQ'd for that reason. So if we're looking at bidder B and bidder C, and you can see bidder C also provided some low carbon alternates, so their bid amount has stayed the same, but their carbon bar, the blue bar, has gone down. So this is how you can visualize and present this information to a client, right? And I think Katie provided an example of how the low cost bidder also was the low carbon bidder, which that does happen a decent amount, which is great. It's not always going to end up that way, like on this project. So I do want to bring up that example too. So in this case, bidder B was the low compared to bidder C, but sorry, low, I should say, for embodied carbon, but they were about $100,000 more expensive for this particular concrete bid package. And so I guess contextualizing this back to the RMI study, with the RMI study, this would say like, oh, this is a no-brainer, like 20 to a 30% reduction from bidder B to bidder C for, this was a $300 million project. $100,000 on a $300 million project doesn't seem like a lot, maybe to outside folks. But of course, when you're sitting down with a client, you're saying, we're leaving $100,000 on the table potentially for this concrete bid package. Again, I've never run into a client that said, oh yeah, no brainer, $100,000, no big deal, high fives all around, we're going with the low carbon option. I've just never seen that before. So even though it's, in reality, $100,000 is less than, it's a fraction of a percent on a $300 million project. I mean, when we're in like GMP mode and trying to hit the project budget, every dollar counts. And so this is just one of those, again, we're not forcing the hand, we're just presenting this information to the client. But like I said, EC3, it has this bid leveling function now. If there are any questions on that, let me know. But that was everything I had. So thank you.